Chapter 6. The Hollow Child. On August 18, 1587, under a blood-coloured dawn that stained the eastern sky like a wound, Eleanor Dare gave birth to her daughter. Virginia, the first English child born in the New World, arrived as the colony held its collective breath. Women had gathered in the birthing hut since midnight: Agnes Pratt with her experienced hands, Mary Chapman with clean linens, Jane Mannering to boil water and herbs. They had prepared as they would for any birth, clinging to ritual as a bulwark against the strangeness that had infiltrated every aspect of their lives. The birth was long, silent. The usual cries of labor were absent, replaced by an unnatural quiet that unnerved the midwives more than screams would have. Eleanor said nothing throughout, no scream, no breathless moans, not even the guttural growls that accompanied the most difficult deliveries. Only a hollow gaze, fixed on something unseen beyond the rafters. When her water broke, it ran black as pitch. Agnes crossed herself but said nothing, exchanging glances with Mary. They had seen too much in recent weeks to show surprise. Jane, the youngest, bit her lip until it bled. "The child comes," Agnes finally said, breaking the oppressive silence. "Push now, Eleanor." Eleanor's face remained expressionless, but her body responded, bearing down with mechanical precision. Her skin was cool despite the exertion, beaded with sweat that smelled faintly of earth after rain. When the child slipped into the world after 18 hours of labor, the midwife expected a wail, that first life-affirming cry that announced a new soul's arrival. But Virginia did not cry. She opened her eyes, wide and glassy grey, and stared straight into the rafters of the birthing hut. No newborn cloudiness dimmed her gaze. She seemed to focus with deliberate intent on something invisible to the women attending her birth. Her tiny hands, perfectly formed, flexed once and went still. Her mouth moved slightly, like tasting the air. Then she made a sound. Not a scream, not a cry, a word. It slipped from her infant lips with impossible clarity. 3 syllables, precisely articulated, in a language that resembled nothing the English women had ever heard. Not the melodic tones of the Croatoan, nor any European tongue. Something older, formed with parts of the mouth not meant for human speech. No one recognized it, but it left the midwife trembling, her hands suddenly slick with fear as she swaddled the unnaturally calm infant. "God save us," Jane whispered, backing toward the door. Agnes cut the cord with shaking hands, noting how it seemed to pulse beneath her knife, how it coiled like something sentient when separated. The afterbirth followed, unnaturally intact, shaped like a perfect spiral. Eleanor's eyes finally focused, landing on her child with an expression not of maternal love, but wary recognition. "You're here," she whispered. Whether greeting or accusation, none could tell. John White, upon hearing of the birth, rushed to his daughter's side. He had been pacing the boundaries of the settlement since labor began, torn between duty to the colony and concern for Eleanor. The messenger found him checking the eastern wall, where the timber had begun to warp despite being freshly cut, bending inward as though under constant pressure from outside. He found Eleanor propped in bed, sweat drying on her face, hair limp against her shoulders. Ananias sat beside her, holding her hand with white-knuckled intensity, his eyes red-rimmed from sleepless vigilance. She did not smile when her father entered. Her eyes drifted past him, toward the small window where afternoon light filtered through cloth coverings. The child lay bundled at her side, wrapped in linen that someone had embroidered with protective crosses. She blinked slowly, without expression, unlike the screwed-up, bewildered face of a typical newborn. Her limbs remained still beneath the swaddling, no random movements or startled reflexes. "She won't feed," Eleanor said flatly. White's brow furrowed with concern. "Is she sick?" "No," Eleanor replied, voice distant. "She's watching." White stepped forward and leaned down to meet the child's gaze, trying to summon the grandfatherly affection he had anticipated feeling at this moment. Instead, unease crawled along his spine as Virginia's eyes shifted to his face with deliberate intent. Her eyes met his. He flinched. There was an oldness in them, unsettling, curious, patient. Recognition flickered in their depths, as though she knew him. had known him before either of them existed in their current forms. Not the unfocused stare of infancy, but the measured assessment of something ancient regarding a temporary vessel, as if she were waiting for something to arrive, or as if she herself were merely the harbinger of what would follow. "She's beautiful," White lied, straightening. "A miracle." Ananias nodded mechanically, but his jaw was tight. He had not let go of Eleanor's hand since White arrived, though she made no move to return the pressure of his fingers. "The first English child born in Virginia," White continued, trying to recapture the historical significance of the moment to drown his unease in patriotic sentiment. "A symbol of our permanence here." Eleanor's laugh was dry, humorless. "Nothing is permanent here," she said, "especially not us." Within days, rumors spread through the settlement. The women who helped with the birth spoke in whispers, their stories growing with each retelling. The other mothers claimed Virginia didn't blink when held, that her eyes followed movement with adult precision, that her skin stayed cool regardless of the stifling heat that blanketed the colony, that she hummed when no one was near, not the formless sounds of infancy, but patterned tones that resembled speech. One woman insisted the child's shadow was wrong, too long, bending in strange directions when lamplight fell across her cradle, that it sometimes moved independently of the infant, reaching tendrils toward anyone who approached. Another swore she heard Virginia whispering in her sleep, in a tongue that turned her stomach to hear, the same language Eleanor sometimes spoke during her increasingly frequent episodes of waking unconsciousness. Agnes Pratt, with her decades of midwifery experience, refused to enter Eleanor's hut again. "That thing came out wrong," she told her husband in the privacy of their tent. "Born knowing, born remembering. No child should have eyes like that." Families with young children began making signs against evil when Eleanor walked by with the infant. Crosses were carved into doorposts. Salt was sprinkled across thresholds. John White dismissed the rumors as hysteria, the natural consequence of collective fear after George Howe's death, the strange occurrences in the forest, the deteriorating relations with the native tribes. Stress and isolation, he told the council, could make the most rational mind susceptible to fancy. But he too had begun to avoid looking Virginia directly in the eye, had begun making excuses to postpone his visits to Eleanor's hut, had found himself washing his hands compulsively after touching the child's swaddling clothes. On the 6th day after Virginia's birth, Wanchese returned. He stumbled out of the forest at twilight, barefoot, skin streaked with green and red vegetable dyes in patterns that recalled the symbols found throughout the settlement. His clothes had rotted from his body, leaving only tattered remnants that hung from his frame like decaying leaves. His hair was matted with something darker than mud, threaded with twigs and corn silk. Most disturbing were his eyes, once sharp with intelligence and suspicion, now glazed and vacant, pupils contracted to pinpoints despite the fading light. His lips were torn, as though he had been chewing something too tough for human teeth. The sentries raised the alarm at his approach, but lowered their weapons when they recognized him. He had been missing since before George Howe's death, vanishing after an argument with Manteo. Some had suspected he'd returned to the mainland, abandoning the colonists to whatever fate awaited them. What returned was still Wanchese in form, but something fundamental had changed. He moved with unnatural grace despite his apparent exhaustion, each step placing his feet precisely as though following patterns invisible to everyone else. When Manteo called his name, running to his kinsman with obvious relief, Wanchese looked up and smiled. It was not a human smile. It was too wide, stretching his cracked lips beyond natural limits. Too knowing, filled with secrets no living mind should contain. His teeth seemed more numerous than before, crowded against each other like stones in ancient walls. He fell to his knees in the dirt and began carving a spiral into his chest with his fingernail, which had hardened into something resembling a claw. The blood that welled from the self-inflicted wound was thick, almost black in the fading light, and smelled of cedar and rot. White pushed through the gathering crowd, desperate for information about what lurked beyond their walls. "Wanchese," he said urgently, "what happened to you? What did you find?" But Wanchese would not answer. He only hummed, the sound rising and falling in a pattern identical to what emerged from Virginia's cradle across the settlement. His eyes rolled back, showing only whites that had taken on a yellowish tinge like old ivory. Finally, as darkness settled over the colony, he spoke. One word, repeated in a voice that seemed to emanate not from his throat, but from the earth beneath him. Returned, returned, returned. That night he vanished again. The guards claimed they never saw him leave, though the eastern gate stood open at dawn, its heavy wooden bar splintered from within as though struck by enormous force. No one followed, no search party was organized, no one spoke of mounting a rescue. By silent consensus, they understood that whatever had walked back into the forest wearing Wanchese's skin was beyond their help, and beyond their comprehension. Soon after, the infants began dying. The first was a girl, 2 weeks old, born just before Virginia's arrival. Healthy the night before, she had nursed vigorously and settled into sleep nestled against her mother's side. Her mother awoke to find her blue and stiff, tiny limbs contorted as though in struggle against invisible restraints. Her eyes were missing, not gouged out, but absorbed, leaving only smooth skin where they had been. The second death came 2 nights later, a boy of 3 months. Found with a mouthful of soil, though the floor of the family's house was solid wood, raised above the ground. The earth in his throat was not local. Harriet examined it and found red clay mixed with seeds no one recognized. A third was discovered in the morning, wrapped in vines, which hadn't been there the night before. They had grown through the floorboards, weaving a living shroud around the infant, penetrating mouth and nostrils as though seeking something within. The child's parents had heard nothing during the night. No struggle, no cry of distress. Only the soft rustling of growth, which they had mistaken for wind through thatch. By the 4th death, a pair of twin girls found with their hearts missing, yet no wound on their bodies, the pattern was undeniable. Only the youngest were taken, only at night, and always with signs that pointed to something impossible, something that moved through earth and wood and flesh with equal ease. Manteo spoke to no one for 2 days after the twins' death. He retreated to a spot near the western wall, fasting and chanting in his native tongue. When he returned to council, his face was drawn, his manner more solemn than ever. He told White, "The island is correcting the wound." "What wound?" White asked, though dread pooled in his stomach at the question. "You brought her here," Manteo said, nodding toward Eleanor's hut, where Virginia lay in her cradle, eyes always open, always watching. "She is not born, she is returned." "Speak plainly," White demanded, exhaustion making his voice harsh. "She's an infant, my granddaughter." Manteo's expression held pity rather than fear. "The old ones need vessels, clean vessels, untouched by time. The others were not suitable." He gestured toward the settlement, where 4 tiny graves had been dug in as many days. They were already too formed, too, themselves. The new one, she came ready, empty, waiting. He met White's gaze steadily. She was always going to be the door. Eleanor stopped holding Virginia after the 3rd infant death. She fed her when necessary, but no longer rocked her to sleep, no longer sang the lullabies she had practiced during pregnancy. She kept the crib at a distance from her own bed, pushing it against the far wall of the hut. At night she placed salt around it in a perfect circle, muttering prayers that mingled Anglican ritual with older, darker supplications. Once, her husband awoke to find her standing over the child, hand trembling over its chest, with a knife taken from their cooking implements. The blade caught moonlight from the window, glinting like malevolent intent made solid. "I wasn't going to," she whispered when she felt his eyes on her. "Not yet." He took the blade from her and said nothing, but moved the knives to a locked chest the following morning. That night he found Eleanor with a sharpened stick instead, watching Virginia with hollow eyes that reflected the same ancient patience as her daughter's. When asked why she feared her own child, Eleanor would only say, "She's hungry, and I'm not enough." Harriet examined the child once, at White's request. The governor hoped the mathematician's analytical mind might dispel the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with Virginia Dare. He came to Eleanor's hut with instruments borrowed from the surgeon's kit, a crude stethoscope, measuring tools, charts of normal infant development. Ananias watched from the doorway, expression guarded, as Harriet bent over the cradle. He checked her pulse, finding it strong but unusually slow. Measured her breathing, noting the perfect regularity that never altered, even when startled. Listened to her chest, where her heart beat in a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the distant drums sometimes heard from the forest. "She's normal," he said finally, though doubt colored his assessment. "Physically at least. Her development is accelerated, muscle tone, alertness, but within natural boundaries." But when he turned to leave, instruments packed away, Virginia watched him with her unblinking eyes. Her mouth opened, and from it emerged a sound no infant throat should produce. Words formed with adult precision in a voice that carried harmonics beneath the childish timbre. "Thomas James Harriet." He froze, skin prickling with atavistic terror. He had not spoken his full name aloud since arriving on Roanoke. Had not used his middle name in decades, not since his mother's death. It appeared on no document in the colony. "What did you say?" he whispered, knowing the question itself was madness. Infants of 2 weeks did not speak, did not form consonants, did not address adults by name. Virginia's lips curved in what might have been a smile on any other child. On her, it resembled the expression one Chasey had worn upon his return. Too knowing, too intentional. "You seek patterns," the infant voice continued, the words formed with impossible clarity. "But you already know. The spiral turns, the root opens, the circle closes." Harriet stumbled from the hut, nearly colliding with Ananias. He did not stop until he reached his own tent, where he collapsed to his knees, body trembling with the effort to contain what he had witnessed. That night he burned every page of his journal, hundreds of careful observations, maps, sketches, calculations. As the flames consumed his work, he watched the smoke form spirals against the canvas ceiling, coiling into patterns that matched those carved into the oldest trees. When the last page turned to ash, he whispered, "Lord, forgive me. I almost understood." Eleanor began sleeping outside the hut a week after Virginia's birth. She made a pallet beneath the overhang of the roof, exposed to evening mist and morning dew. When asked why, she said simply, "She dreams too loudly." Her condition deteriorated rapidly. The woman who had maintained composure through the crossing from England, through the hardships of settlement, through a pregnancy haunted by visions, now unraveled visibly. Her hair fell out in clumps. She forgot to eat. Her conversations became disjointed, sliding between English and that other language that made listeners' teeth ache. She drew constantly, spirals, eyes, trees with human limbs. When she ran out of paper, she used charcoal on tent walls, fingernails on wooden posts, blood from her cracked lips on scraps of cloth. Always the same images, always connected by fine lines that resembled roots or veins, spreading outward from a central figure that might have been Virginia, might have been the ancient tree where William Pratt was found, might have been something older than either. One morning, the colony found her curled against the palisade wall, whispering a lullaby in a language no one recognized. Her fingers had worn bleeding grooves into the wood as she traced the spirals only she could see. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, focused on something beyond the physical world. Inside the hut, Virginia lay in her cradle, wide awake as always. She never seemed to sleep, merely shifted between states of stillness. Her grey eyes tracked the movements of those who entered. Her tiny fingers flexed in patterns that matched her mother's drawings. And on her face, a smile, not the reflexive grimace of infancy, but something deliberate. Satisfied. Patient, as though everything were proceeding exactly as planned. Chapter 7. The Croatoan Pact. By the time John White ordered the diplomatic envoy, desperation had replaced pride. The governor who had arrived on Roanoke's shores with visions of prosperity and English glory now moved through the settlement like a ghost, shoulders bent with the weight of compounding horrors. 3 infants dead in their cradles, their bodies altered in ways that defied explanation. Another missing entirely, the child's blanket found shredded and stained with a fluid that smelled of tree sap. One Chasey returned and vanished like a ghost, leaving behind only spirals carved into dirt and wood. And Virginia, always silent, always watching, continued to breathe a presence into the camp that chilled even hardened men. The colonists whispered of curses now, not simply misfortune. Prayers went unanswered. Crosses carved into doorways twisted overnight into other symbols. The very air seemed to thicken after sunset, pressing against lungs and skin like something alive and curious. They called Virginia the Hollow Child, not to Eleanor's face, but the name spread nonetheless. Breathed between sentries during midnight watches, muttered by women who crossed themselves when the infant's grey eyes tracked their movements across the common area. White stood at the eastern wall before dawn, watching mist curl between trees that seemed closer than the day before. Sleep had become an enemy. Dreams waited there, dreams of roots pushing through his flesh, of his granddaughter's mouth opening wider and wider until her face disappeared entirely. Behind him, the settlement stirred, smoke rising from breakfast fires, voices kept unnaturally low, as though anything louder might attract attention from the watching forest. "We need help," he admitted aloud to Ananias, who had joined him at the wall. The words tasted like defeat. "The Croatoan?" Ananias asked, face gaunt from sleepless nights spent watching his wife and child. White nodded. "If anyone knows what haunts us, it would be those who lived here before." "Manteo might refuse," Ananias warned. "After what happened to Wanchese—" "He'll go," White interrupted. "He still believes he can save us. God knows why." Manteo agreed to mediate with his people, what remained of them. He had grown increasingly silent as conditions deteriorated, spending hours staring into the forest with an expression that mixed grief and resignation. When White approached him with the proposal, he nodded once, as though he had been waiting for the request. "They may not welcome you," he warned. "The Croatoan believe your child who is not a child has awakened something best left sleeping." "Tell them we seek understanding," White replied, "and a way forward." Manteo's smile was cold. "There is only one way forward now. But you are not ready to hear it." The Croatoan village lay 2 days' journey south across the Sound, nestled amid low dunes and swaying pines. The journey was tense, each man startling at natural sounds, bird calls, wind through branches, the splash of fish in shallows. They traveled in a small boat, hugging the coastline, 4 men with weapons ready and eyes constantly scanning for threats. Bennett claimed to see figures walking beneath the water's surface, keeping pace with their vessel. No one disputed him. The village was once a vibrant place filled with smoke, laughter, and fire-roasted fish. White remembered it from his previous visit. Children chasing each other between huts, women grinding corn, men fashioning tools beside communal fires. The air had been rich with cooking and living and shared humanity. But when the envoy arrived, it was half empty. An unnatural silence hung over the settlement, broken only by the rhythmic pounding of waves against the nearby shore and the mournful cry of gulls overhead. Manteo led White and 2 guards past abandoned huts, their entrances sealed with intricate bundles of twigs and shells. Vacant cooking pits held ashes too perfectly arranged to be natural, concentric circles, spirals, patterns that matched those appearing throughout the English settlement. Torn prayer flags flapped in the sea wind, their symbols altered by knife cuts that formed new meanings. Most disturbing were the effigies, dozens of them, erected around the village perimeter. Crude figures of sticks and mud, each bent backward at impossible angles, mouths stretched wide and filled with small white flowers that resembled infant teeth. "A barrier," Manteo explained, noting White's unease, "to keep what walks on Roanoke from following those who fled." "Did it work?" asked Bennett, hand never leaving his knife hilt. Manteo's eyes scanned the empty pathways between huts. "For some. Only the elders remained, 7 ancient figures huddled around a circle of ash at the village's heart. They sat cross-legged on woven mats, bodies painted in white mud that had dried to a cracked, flaking mask. Their eyes were bloodshot and red-rimmed from sleeplessness, yet alert with a fever-bright intensity that suggested sustained terror rather than illness. They welcomed Manteo with soft hands pressed against his cheeks, murmuring words too low for the English to catch. But their eyes lingered on White, neither hostile nor welcoming, evaluating, measuring, as one might regard a diseased limb before deciding whether amputation was necessary. Manteo spoke in rapid Croatoan, gesturing toward White and then sweeping his hand toward the north, presumably indicating Roanoke Island. The elders listened without interruption, faces impassive. Only their hands betrayed agitation, fingers constantly moving, tracing patterns in the air that resembled writing or weaving. "He comes not as conqueror," Manteo finally translated for White's benefit, "but as a man seeking truth." The eldest among them, a woman with bark-colored scars across her neck that formed a pattern like tree rings, leaned forward and whispered in a croaking voice. Her breath smelled of herbs and something metallic, like blood or iron. Manteo's brow tightened as he translated, "The land is taking flesh." White frowned, suspecting linguistic confusion. "What does that mean?" Manteo hesitated, clearly searching for English words adequate to the concept. "It means the god has chosen to walk again, to assume form, to birth itself through those receptive to its voice." "Virginia," White said flatly, his worst fears confirmed. The old woman tilted her head, the movement unnervingly similar to his granddaughter's bird-like gesture. She spoke again, longer this time, her gnarled fingers sketching shapes that matched Eleanor's unconscious drawings. "She says the child is only the beginning," Manteo translated. "The door, not what passes through it." White's stomach clenched. "And what passes through?" Manteo turned to the old woman, posed the question. She closed her eyes and swayed slightly, as though hearing distant music. When she spoke again, all the elders joined her, voices overlapping in rhythmic chant. "Camora Teth," Manteo said softly, "he who speaks through roots, the sleeper in earth, the hunger without end." They spoke through dusk, seated around a fire that burned green at its edges, fed with herbs that released a smoke that seemed to clarify thought, while simultaneously making the world seem more permeable, boundaries between things less certain. The elders told stories of an ancient time when the land rose against the people, when roots pierced huts and rivers ran backward. They spoke of entire villages swallowed overnight, of children born with eyes that reflected knowledge no human should possess, of trees that moved when no one was watching. "They say this happened before the Croatoan came to the island," Manteo explained, as an elder with a voice like rustling leaves spoke at length. "Before the Secotan, before any people they know. The oldest stories came from those they found here, shell people who lived in the marshes and spoke to the water." "And what happened to them?" White asked, though he dreaded the answer. "They went into the earth," Manteo replied after listening to the conclusion. "Willingly, the stories say, to appease what stirred below." White tried to maintain his skepticism, to find rational explanations for what he was hearing. But the events at the colony, the unnatural deaths, the speaking child, the moving trees, had eroded his certainty in natural law. "They said the earth had a mouth once, and it opened every 7 generations to remember itself," Manteo continued, his usual stoicism giving way to visible unease. "That it hungers not for flesh, but for memory, for the dream stuff of human minds. That it feeds on fear and wonder and the moment of recognition when one realizes one's place in the vastness of time. And it always begins," he added gravely, watching White's face, "with the birth of a child with no breath." White stiffened, recalling Agnes Pratt's description of Virginia's birth, how the infant had not cried, had not gasped for air as all newborns must. "Virginia breathes. Not with lungs," Manteo said, "but with memory." The elders told him to leave the island. The female elder made a cutting motion across her throat, her meaning unmistakable even without translation. "Tonight," Manteo added, "or none will see the third moon." White looked to the stars beginning to blink through the canopy above, considering the logistics of moving over 100 settlers with winter approaching. "We need food, protection, shelter. They say none of it will matter when the trees begin to speak." Manteo's voice had taken on a hollow quality, as though he himself had begun to believe the stories he translated. "When the roots reach for the surface, when the spiral completes." The fire dimmed suddenly, shadows lengthening around the circle. The elders rose as one, backing away from White as though he carried contagion. The old woman approached Manteo, pressing something into his palm. A small pouch made from deerskin, sewn shut with what looked like human hair. For the hollow child, Manteo translated her whisper, to close what should never have opened. White reached for it, but Manteo closed his fist around the pouch. "This is not for you to give," he said. "The choice belongs to the mother." The elders disappeared into their huts, doors sealed with elaborate knots of vine. The sudden termination of the meeting left White with more questions than answers, more fear than reassurance. "Will they help us?" he asked as they walked back to their camp on the beach. Manteo's silence was answer enough. The next morning, White returned to Roanoke. Manteo stayed behind, saying he needed to perform rites of severance to protect what little Croatoan remained. He promised to follow within days, though something in his manner suggested he might be considering abandoning the English to their fate. White could not blame him. The journey back seemed longer, the familiar coastline somehow altered, landmarks shifted or missing entirely. Bennett saw things beneath the water again, pale shapes keeping pace with their boat, hands reaching upward from impossible depths. This time Cooper confirmed the sighting, his weathered face going slack with dread. "They're herding us," he whispered. "Back to the mouth." White pretended not to hear. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier. He walked back into camp with sagging shoulders and hollow eyes. The settlement had deteriorated in the few days of his absence, new symbols carved into the palisade wall, tents sagging as though the very air inside them had grown heavy, faces gaunt with fear and sleeplessness. Eleanor sat outside her hut, Virginia in her lap, both perfectly still, watching his approach without recognition. "What news?" asked Harriet, intercepting him before he could retreat to his quarters. The mathematician looked worse than when White had left, hair unkempt, eyes feverish with what might have been madness or revelation. White sat down slowly on a log beside the central fire, which burned too hot despite the mild day. "They're leaving," he said. "The whole tribe." "Why?" Harriet demanded, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. He stared into the fire, watching the flames form patterns too deliberate to be random. "Because they believe we've cursed the land, or awoken something that cannot be put back to sleep." Harriet laughed, a brittle sound. "Cursed, yes. Or perhaps blessed, depending on what one worships." He pulled a journal from his pocket, not his careful scientific notes, but something new, pages covered in cramped writing. "I've been documenting the changes, in the soil, in the water, in ourselves." "Changes," White echoed, too weary to properly focus. "We're becoming something else," Harriet said, voice dropping to a whisper. "All of us. The child is merely the first to complete the transition." That night, the sky turned red at the edges, as though the sunset had frozen and intensified rather than fading to proper darkness. The bloody glow suffused the settlement, painting faces and structures in shades of crimson and copper. Strange lights flickered through the forest, glowing orbs that hovered without sound, weaving through branches like curious insects. They pulsed softly, casting shadows that danced across the colony in patterns that resembled primitive language, symbols forming and dissolving too quickly to interpret. Children screamed, mothers wept. Men stood at the walls with weapons drawn, though all knew instinctively that steel and shot would mean nothing against whatever approached. Some claimed to see faces inside the lights, distorted, eyeless, whispering words that scraped against the mind rather than the ear. Others described the lights as windows, openings into somewhere that existed alongside their world, but followed different physical laws. One guard fired his crossbow at them. The bolt disappeared in mid-air, swallowed by light that flared briefly brighter before resuming its measured pulse. Harriet recorded it all in his new journal, now written in coded Latin interspersed with symbols of his own design. His hand shook as he sketched the lights, noting their positions, their movements, the effect they had on those who watched too long. 3 colonists had fallen into seizures, foam flecking their lips as they chanted in that language that no human throat should form. Eleanor didn't speak at all. She stood outside her hut, baby in arms, both bathed in the unnatural glow. Virginia's eyes reflected the lights, multiplying them like tiny mirrors. For the first time since her birth, she showed animation, tiny hands reaching toward the lights, fingers spread wide in what might have been welcome or supplication. Virginia giggled, the sound carrying across the settlement with unnatural clarity, silencing even the most hysterical cries. It was not an infant's guileless laugh, but something ancient and satisfied, the sound of recognition after long separation. The lights intensified, moving closer to the walls. Where they touched wood, the timber smoked and darkened, grain patterns rearranging into familiar spirals. Dawn came reluctantly, light struggling through a sky that had lost its proper blue. The sun appeared dimmer, its warmth diminished. The lights retreated with first light, but their presence lingered in scorched wood, in new symbols etched into soil, in the fixed stares of those who had watched too long. The next morning, Manteo returned, alone. White approached him at the palisade gate, noting how the native's expression had changed. Resignation replacing his usual reserve, as though he had finally accepted what had merely been suspected before. "The village?" White asked, not truly wanting the answer. "Gone." "All of them?" Manteo nodded, fingers absently tracing one of the scorched symbols on the gatepost. "Those who could walk have fled to the mainland. The old ones," he faltered, composure cracking, "those who stayed are no longer Croatoan. The god has taken them, or something in its name." He looked over White's shoulder at the huts and fires and frightened faces, at Virginia, who watched from Eleanor's arms with her unblinking gaze, at the trees beyond the palisade, which had visibly advanced during the night, roots breaking through soil at the very edge of the cleared ground. "This place will burn," he said softly. "You must prepare for the voice in the earth." "What voice?" White demanded, clinging to leadership, though it had become a hollow performance. Manteo touched the pouch at his belt, the old woman's gift. "When it speaks through all of us. When we become its tongue." His eyes met White's, and for a moment the governor saw something shift behind them, something ancient and patient, looking through human eyes. "It's already begun," Manteo added. White gathered his council that night in the central longhouse. The building felt less substantial than it had days before, the walls thinner, the air inside viscous and difficult to breathe. 6 gaunt faces stared back at him in the lamplight, waiting for solutions he did not possess. "We need to reinforce the palisade," he began, clinging to practical measures. "Move all tents into the central clearing. Double the watch." No one responded. The words felt meaningless even as he spoke them. Harriet leaned forward, candlelight catching on spectacles that magnified eyes now permanently dilated. "Do you believe them now? The Croatoan, the warnings?" White's jaw clenched, his last defenses crumbling. "I believe we brought something with us, or woke something old. I believe this colony is no longer ours." The council members exchanged glances, relieved that their collective fear had finally been acknowledged by their leader. The naming of their doom, paradoxically, brought the first peace they had known in weeks. Eleanor entered without invitation, moving with the dreamy steadiness that had characterized her since Virginia's birth. Her hair hung loose around her face, threaded with leaves and twigs, as though she had been lying on forest ground. Her eyes were clear for the first time in weeks, focused with disturbing intensity. She stood before the council and held up Virginia, presenting the infant as one might display an icon or religious artifact. The child watched the assembled men with her usual unblinking stare, grey eyes reflecting more light than the room contained. "She already belongs to it," Eleanor said, voice stronger than it had been since labor, "and so do we." No one argued, no one suggested alternatives or plans or prayers. The fire sputtered low, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of the figures that created them. And outside the walls, the woods began to whisper, a sound like countless voices speaking in unison, like wind through hollow bones, like something ancient finally drawing enough breath to speak its own name. Chapter 8. The Forgotten Language. Thomas Harriot sat cross-legged on the dirt floor of his hut, ink staining his fingers, dozens of parchment scraps spread around him like broken teeth. Candlelight danced across his face, casting the glyphs into motion as though they lived. He hadn't slept in 2 days. He couldn't. Not with the symbols moving in his dreams. The glyphs, etched into trees, painted in blood, drawn by Eleanor in her fugue states, were not random. They followed rules, patterns, cadences. They were language. but not of any people he had ever studied. Not Algonquian, not Norse, not Latin, Greek, or Sumerian. These marks belonged to something older than civilization, older than writing itself. They were a tongue spoken not by mouths, but by memory, a ritual language. Harriet's hand trembled as he dipped his quill. The ink was running low. He'd scraped the bottom of the pot with water thrice now, making it thin and grey, but it was all he had left. The symbols demanded transcription regardless. They burned behind his eyelids, whether open or closed. He had categorized 43 distinct marks. Some appeared to be verbs, action and movement through spaces he couldn't comprehend. Others conveyed concepts that made his mind recoil, the sensation of existing in multiple places simultaneously, of seeing through stone, of breathing water as though it were air. "Scholar," came a voice from the doorway. Harriet startled, knocking over the ink. He cursed, watching it soak into several carefully copied pages. Eleanor Dare stood at the threshold, dark circles beneath his eyes. "Have you seen Eleanor today?" "No," Harriet said, frantically dabbing at the spilled ink with his sleeve. "Not since yesterday at the well." "She wasn't in our bed this morning." Ananias's voice cracked. "Virginia was alone in her cradle. I've searched the settlement." Harriet paused his cleanup, suddenly alert. "The forests." White sent 2 men to look. Nothing yet. Ananias stepped inside, his gaze falling on the scattered papers. His face twisted in disgust. "Those marks. Eleanor draws them everywhere now." Harriet gathered the pages protectively, suddenly wary. "She's helping me understand them." "Helping?" Ananias laughed bitterly. "She doesn't even know she's doing it. I watch her at night, scratching at the walls in her sleep until her fingers bleed." He picked up one of the parchments. "What are they?" "I don't know yet," Harriet lied. It was Manteo who confirmed his suspicions 2 hours later. He entered Harriet's hut without ceremony and stared at the parchments. His expression soured immediately. "You must burn them," he said. Harriet looked up, bleary-eyed. "Why?" Manteo pointed to one spiral-shaped glyph. "This is not a word. It is a summons, a beacon. Every time it is drawn, the god sees more." Harriet whispered, "And if I can learn it? Then you teach it to the others." Harriet shook his head, desperation edging into his voice. "No, if I understand it, I can control it, counteract it." Manteo's eyes narrowed. "There is a sickness in you, scholar. The symbols have already taken root." He reached for Harriet's papers. "We burn them now." Harriet lunged forward, shoving Manteo with surprising strength. "Don't touch them." The 2 men froze, startled by the outburst. Harriet stared at his own hands in disbelief. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I don't know what." "It protects itself," Manteo said quietly. "Through you." He backed away toward the door. "I will speak with White. The fire must be prepared." After Manteo left, Harriet gathered his most important translations and hid them beneath the floorboards. Something in him knew that burning the transcriptions would do nothing. The symbols lived now, in his mind, in Eleanor's fingers, in the colony's collective unconscious. Eleanor had started scratching symbols into the wood beams of her hut. At first, simple lines and curls, then entire passages, as if she were transcribing something dictated in her sleep. She didn't remember doing it, but her hands were always stained with soot in the morning. Her fingernails blackened. One wall bore a complete sequence, 12 marks in a loop, forming a closed eye. When Harriet saw it, he wept. "That's a prayer," he said, "but not to anything human." Eleanor was found that afternoon, standing knee-deep in the brackish swamp water a half-mile from the settlement. Her dress was torn, her feet bleeding from the journey through thorn bushes and sharp rocks, but she seemed to feel no pain. She was painting symbols onto a massive cypress tree with mud mixed with her own blood. When White and Ananias reached her, she didn't resist being led back to the colony. Her eyes remained unfocused, lips moving in silent recitation. "Was she speaking?" White asked as they approached the palisade. "Not words," Ananias replied, "just sounds, like wind through stones." That night, Eleanor sat docile as Jane Pierce cleaned her wounds. Virginia nursed contentedly at her breast, as though nothing were amiss. When Harriet entered their hut, Eleanor's eyes snapped to him with sudden clarity. "You've seen them too," she said. Not a question. Harriet nodded, throat tight. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" Eleanor smiled, stroking Virginia's wispy hair. "So elegant. So precise." "What do they want, Eleanor?" Harriet asked, careful to keep his voice level. "To come home." She looked down at Virginia. "To be remembered." Sleepwalking spread through the colony like infection. Children wandered barefoot through the trees. Mothers awoke to find their husbands standing motionless in the cornfields, heads tilted toward the ground. One woman walked into the ocean and didn't return. Another was found writing in the dirt with her own hair. White imposed a dusk curfew and shackled the most restless to stakes for their own safety. But even then, some slipped their bonds without unlocking the chains. He began to write a new journal, one not for the colony, but for whoever might one day find the ruins. A secret log, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the longhouse. "If this place falls," he wrote, "let them know it was not madness or nature. It was memory. Something older than language has learned to speak again. And it speaks with us." The affliction showed no pattern White could discern. Young and old, men and women, the devout and the skeptics, all were equally susceptible. By the second week, only 14 colonists remained untouched by the sleepwalking. White gathered them in the longhouse, away from the others. "We must consider the possibility," he said carefully, "that this is no natural ailment." Roger Pratt, the colony's cooper, spat onto the floor. "It's witchcraft. That savage Manteo has cursed us." "No," White said firmly. "Manteo is as disturbed by these events as we are." "Then what is it?" Jane Pierce asked, clutching her rosary. "Devil's work?" White exchanged a glance with Harriet, who stood silently in the corner. "Perhaps something older than the devil himself." That night, George Howe's 7-year-old son climbed to the top of the palisade wall and balanced precariously on the sharpened logs. When guards tried to reach him, he smiled serenely and recited a sequence of sounds that made the men's ears bleed. It took 3 colonists to finally bring the boy down, and even then he fought with inhuman strength until exhaustion finally claimed him. In the morning, no one spoke of it. The guards who had heard the boy's recitation walked with vacant expressions, responding to questions with delayed, hollow answers. Dysentery struck the following day, a welcome distraction from the sleepwalking, though White suspected a connection. Those afflicted with the intestinal sickness developed raised welts on their skin that resembled certain glyphs Harriet had catalogued. Harriet himself had grown increasingly reclusive. White found him in his hut, surrounded by new transcriptions. The scholar's right arm was covered in self-inflicted cuts, arranged in precise patterns. "The blood makes the connection stronger," Harriet explained without looking up. "I can hear them now, Governor. They speak at the edge of understanding." "Who speaks?" White demanded. "The ones who were here first." Harriet's eyes were fever-bright. "Before the forests, before the seas rose, before air." White seized Harriet by the shoulders. "Listen to me. You must fight this influence." "Why fight?" Harriet smiled. "They only want to return. This was their home long before it was ours." Manteo began fasting. On the 3rd night, he stripped naked and painted his chest with ochre, laying roots and stones in a circle around the colony's edge. "I will speak to the spirits of the deep forest," he told White, "if they still remember mercy." "What if they don't?" Manteo looked at the stars. "Then there is only fire." The ritual lasted from sunset to midnight. Manteo danced until sweat poured from his body, chanting in a language that predated his people. White watched from a distance, his hand never leaving the pistol at his belt. When Manteo finally collapsed, White rushed to his side. The native's eyes rolled back, showing only whites as his body convulsed. "The land remembers," he gasped. "The old ones sleep beneath the island. Your digging wakes them." "What digging?" White asked. "Foundations," Manteo clutched White's wrist. "The well, the root cellars. You cut into flesh that was not meant to be disturbed." "How do we stop it?" "You can't. The door is opening." Manteo's breathing slowed. "But she might seal it again." "Who?" "The child born of 2 worlds, your granddaughter." That night the air thickened. A wind blew through the colony, but the trees did not sway. Instead, they listened. And one by one, the colonists awoke in silence and walked to the center of camp, gathering in a ring without speaking. Eleanor stood among them, cradling Virginia. The child's eyes glowed faintly. Her mouth moved, soundless. Then she said one word, low, resonant, impossible for a child's throat. Kateth. The colonists collapsed, unconscious. When they awoke, they remembered nothing. But each of them bore a new mark etched into their skin, a symbol, a word, a name. Harriet traced the mark on his forearm with trembling fingers. Unlike the others who bore their symbols on shoulders or backs, his appeared directly over his veins, a vertical line with 3 crossing horizontals, each ending in tiny spirals. "It's changing," he whispered to himself, watching as the mark seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. Not a tattoo or burn, but something living beneath his skin, as though the glyph had replaced the blood in that vein. By noon, 7 colonists had fallen into seizures. Their mouths moved in perfect unison, forming words no human mouth was meant to shape. White ordered them isolated in the storehouse, windows covered with leather hides. "What happened last night?" White demanded, cornering Harriet outside the palisade. "Virginia spoke, didn't she?" Harriet nodded, unable to meet the governor's eyes. "The child. She named something." "Named what?" "I believe," Harriet said carefully, "she named a part of herself. Or rather, what's growing inside her." "Blasphemy," White hissed, though his voice lacked conviction. "Is it blasphemy to name what God himself has forgotten?" Harriet countered. "These entities existed before Eden, Governor. Perhaps they watched the creation from outside." White's hand moved to the hilt of his dagger. "You speak as one possessed." "We all are," Harriet smiled sadly. "Some just know it better than others." The colony's livestock began to die that afternoon. Chickens twisted their own necks until bones splintered through skin. Goats smashed their skulls against fence posts. 2 horses broke free and galloped into the sea, vanishing beneath the waves without struggle. When butchered for what meat could be salvaged, each animal's organs were found arranged in patterns matching the symbols from Harriet's collection. Their blood ran thick and dark, almost black. No one ate that night. Eleanor sat in her hut, scraping the walls with her fingernails until they bled. The symbols flowed from her without thought, each one perfectly formed despite her lack of training. Virginia lay in her cradle, silent but watchful, eyes tracking movements that weren't there. When Ananias entered with bread and water, Eleanor didn't acknowledge him. Her gaze remained fixed on the wall where she had drawn an intricate series of connected spirals. "Eleanor," Ananias whispered, "please stop this." She turned to him with eyes suddenly clear. "I'm translating," she said simply. "Translating what?" "The memories. They were here before us." She touched Virginia's forehead. "Before anything with bones or breath. They slept in the rocks until we woke them with our digging and burning." Ananias backed toward the door. "I'll fetch Harriet." "No need," Eleanor smiled. "He already understands some of it. But the symbols speak clearer to women, to mothers." She looked down at their daughter, "and clearest to the newly born." Ananias fled, nearly colliding with Roger Pratt outside. The Cooper's eyes were vacant, his neck marked with a glyph that resembled a twisted tree. "They're singing," Roger murmured. "Can you hear it? Under the ground?" From every hut came the sound of humming, a discordant melody that made the air vibrate. Children joined first, then women, then men. A harmony that followed no human scale. Manteo knelt before White in the longhouse, his expression grave. "My people have stories," he said, "of a time when the sea was higher, when strange cities stood where forests now grow. The builders were not like men. They spoke to waters and stones." White's quill scratched frantically across parchment. "Are these the beings responsible? Some ancient tribe?" Manteo shook his head. "Not tribe. Gods, or demons. My ancestors called them the Hollow Ones. They had no faces, only mouths that opened inward." He traced a spiral in the dirt. "They left marks like these as warnings. Boundaries. To cross them was to invite possession. And we built our colony on such a boundary," White concluded. "Worse," Manteo said. You built it on a door. White paced the length of the longhouse. A door to what? To where they were banished, Manteo replied. The space between spaces. Not heaven or hell, but somewhere no living mind should touch. He studied White's face. Your people are becoming their language, their way back. Can it be closed? Only by the one who opened it. White's mind went to Virginia, the child born on this soil, the first English life to begin in the New World, adore herself in a way. And if we leave this place, White asked. The door follows those who bear the marks now, Manteo said softly, and the marks are spreading. That evening, Harriet finally understood. The symbols weren't just a language, they were coordinates, distances, angles of alignment between stars that no longer existed and lands long since swallowed by the sea, and repeated together in the proper sequence, they were directions home, for something that had been exiled. He rushed to White's quarters, clutching his translations. Governor, we must stop Eleanor. She's transcribing a summoning ritual piece by piece. Each sleepwalker adds another fragment. White showed him the secret journal, pages filled with observations of the colony's decline. Look here, he pointed to a crude map. The places where people collapse while sleepwalking. They form the same pattern as the stars Eleanor draws on her walls. Harriet's blood went cold. It's already begun. What has? White demanded. The alignment, Harriet whispered. Tonight the stars will mirror the pattern of the settlement, the pattern of the glyphs. He turned to White, eyes wide with terror and wonder. We've been building a celestial key without knowing it. Every hut, every garden plot, every grave, all positioned to unlock something. White grabbed his arm. Can it be stopped? Harriet stared at his own marked skin. I don't think either of us wants to stop it anymore. In the night, Virginia began to cry, a sound so normal, so human that Eleanor wept with relief. She lifted her daughter, rocking her gently. Hush now, she whispered. Mother's here. Virginia's cries stopped abruptly. Her tiny hand reached up, touching Eleanor's cheek. The contact burned like ice. Kateth namor, Virginia said, her infant mouth forming impossible consonants. Shemlath vre. And Eleanor understood, perfectly, as though she had always known this language. She carried Virginia outside, where other colonists had gathered in the moonlight. 34 of them stood in formation, each in their assigned position, mouths moving in silent recitation. Their skin marks glowed faintly blue. At the center stood Harriet, tears streaming down his face as his hand moved independently of his will, drawing the final glyph in the dirt. I'm sorry, he choked out. I can't stop. Virginia squirmed in Eleanor's arms, reaching toward the completed circle of symbols. The ground beneath them began to tremble. It remembers being here, Eleanor said, her voice oddly doubled. It remembers the taste of sunlight. White watched from the shadows, clutching Manteo's hunting knife. He had already decided, if the ritual couldn't be stopped, he would save Virginia from whatever was coming, even if it meant killing his own granddaughter. But as he stepped forward, the earth split beneath Harriet's feet. Not a simple crack, but a precise opening, edges smooth as though cut with a blade, forming a perfect spiral that descended into unfathomable darkness. From within came a sound like rushing water and grinding stone, and rising with it, illuminated by a phosphorescent glow, a shape that seemed to fold inward upon itself endlessly, geometries that made the eye water and the mind recoil. Virginia reached toward it, laughing. The colonists began to sing, that same inhuman harmony, as the thing emerged. With each note, their skin marks brightened, connecting them to each other with threads of luminous blue energy. Eleanor held Virginia higher, presenting her to the entity. She bears your name, she called out. She speaks your words. The shape undulated, extending what might have been a limb or a tendril toward the infant. It paused, hovering just inches from Virginia's reaching fingers. White broke from his paralysis and lunged forward, knife raised. But Manteo was faster. He tackled White from behind, driving them both into the dirt. Not yet, he hissed. Watch. Virginia's tiny hand touched the appendage of light and shadow. For one terrible moment, silence fell. Then the child spoke again, not in the ancient tongue, but in clear English. "No," she said, her voice still impossibly mature. "You are not welcome. Not yet." The entity recoiled as though struck. The glowing marks on the colonists flickered. Virginia continued, her voice growing stronger. "The alignment is incomplete, the sacrifice unprepared. Return when the third moon rises in the void season." The shape writhed, seeming to argue, but Virginia's small face hardened with authority. "Return," she commanded again. And to everyone's shock, the entity began to recede, folding back into the spiral opening. The ground sealed behind it, leaving only a perfect glyph burned into the soil. Virginia went limp in Eleanor's arms, suddenly just an exhausted infant once more. The colonists stood frozen, confused, their glowing marks fading to dull scars. One by one, they returned to their huts as though awakening from sleepwalking, recalling nothing of what had transpired. White shoved Manteo aside and rushed to Eleanor, who swayed on her feet. "What happened?" White demanded. "What did Virginia do?" Eleanor looked at him with clear eyes for the first time in weeks. "She bought us time," she whispered. "It wasn't ready to cross fully, she knew that somehow." "But it will return?" Eleanor nodded, clutching Virginia protectively. "When the conditions are right, when we're ready to receive it properly." "And the markings? The sleepwalking?" "Just preparations," she said. "We're becoming suitable vessels." Harriet remained kneeling in the dirt, tracing the burned glyph with reverent fingers. "Not a summoning," he murmured. "An invitation. It cannot force its way in. It must be welcomed." He looked up at White, eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "And we just postponed the welcome feast." White helped Eleanor back to her hut, mind racing. Whatever had happened, they had gained a reprieve. But for how long? And at what cost? In her cradle, Virginia slept peacefully, her breath slow and even. But when White leaned close to stroke her cheek, he saw that her eyes were moving rapidly beneath their lids. And on her tiny palm, a new symbol had appeared. One even Harriet had never documented. It was a promise, or a countdown. Chapter 9. Erosion of Reason. The first suicide came with the rain. A young man named Peter Miles was found hanging from the palisade, his body twisted in the morning mist, eyes staring blankly toward the ocean. The rope he'd used was braided from his own hair and vine. At his feet was a phrase carved into the mud with fingernails: "She walks in me." No one claimed to understand it, but several looked at Eleanor. George Howe discovered the body at dawn. His shouts brought others running. Then silence fell as they formed a circle around Peter's corpse. The young man's face bore an expression not of anguish, but of serene acceptance. His fingernails were worn to the quick, bloody, from carving his final message. "Cut him down," White ordered, his voice faltering. No one moved. "I said cut him down." Roger Pratt finally stepped forward with a knife. As he reached up to saw through the braided rope, Peter's head rotated unnaturally, bones cracking audibly. Several colonists gasped. Pratt stumbled backward. The hanging man's mouth opened. A single black moth fluttered out, circled once, and disappeared into the morning fog. When they finally lowered the body, they found a pattern of welts across his back, the same spiral glyph that had appeared in the soil after Virginia had turned away the entity. The symbol had been carved into his flesh from within, pushing outward like braille. They buried him that afternoon without ceremony. No one spoke of the moth. More followed. A woman drowned herself in the well, arms tied to her sides. A hunter slit his throat and wrote in blood across his hut's interior, "Too loud inside, had to let it out." Jane Pierce was the woman in the well. They found her floating face down, dress billowing like a pale mushroom. Her arms were bound with strips torn from her own clothing, tied in intricate knots that sailors later swore were not of any human design. When they pulled her from the water, a colony of small white crabs scuttled from her mouth and nostrils. They disappeared into cracks in the soil before anyone could catch them. The well water turned brackish after that, though they were miles from the ocean. It tasted of salt and copper. Those who drank it reported dreams of vast underwater cities with architecture that defied comprehension. Francis Cooper was the hunter. His throat had been cut with such precision that Harriet remarked it couldn't have been self-inflicted. Yet there were no signs of struggle, and the knife remained clutched in Cooper's hand. The hut's interior walls were covered in his blood, not random spatters, but deliberate script. The phrases interwoven in English and something older. Too loud inside, had to let it out. The voice has teeth. It grows new eyes under my skin. When White ordered the hut burned, the flames turned green. No one slept that night. Disappearing became as common as death. Men vanished during patrol, children stepped into the woods and never returned. One night, 2 women went to gather herbs and were later found naked. Eyes gouged, hands held as if willingly led. Christopher Coleman vanished from a patrol. His musket was found embedded barrel first in the trunk of a tree, as though it had been fired into the wood and then swallowed whole. The tree leaked red sap for weeks afterward. 3 children, siblings aged 4, 6, and 9, walked hand in hand into the forest one morning while their mother slept. Tracking dogs followed their scent to the edge of a small pond, where it vanished. The dogs whimpered and refused to approach the water. That night, the pond's surface froze solid despite the summer heat. The ice formed patterns that Harriet recognized as fragments of his translated glyphs. The 2 women were Mary and Catherine, sisters who had volunteered to gather feverfew for the increasing number of colonists suffering from headaches and night terrors. They were discovered 3 days later in a clearing 2 miles from the settlement, their bodies arranged in a tableau of grotesque intimacy. Their eye sockets were hollow but bloodless, as though the eyes had been carefully removed rather than gouged. Their hands remained clasped together, rigor mortis unable to separate them. Most disturbing was the circle of perfect footprints surrounding them, small, like a child's, but with an extra toe on each foot. White posted double guards, but the men grew useless. They shook, they muttered. Some simply ran into the dark and never returned. Those who remained at their posts reported sounds from the forest, wet, sliding noises, and voices that called to them using the voices of lost loved ones from England. One guard swore he heard his dead mother singing his childhood lullaby from just beyond the tree line. The men took to stuffing their ears with wax and cloth. It didn't help. The voices found other ways in. Then came Thomas Willoughby. A former carpenter, once soft-spoken and devout, he was found crouched over the body of his cousin, chewing through raw flesh, face drenched in red. When Harriet and 2 others tried to stop him, Willoughby hissed, not screamed, not shouted, but hissed, low and reptilian. "I told her I was hungry," he whispered, blood running from his lips, "and she said this feeds better." They locked him in the root cellar, bound and gagged. By morning, he had chewed through his own fingers. Willoughby had been among the most pious of the colonists, leading evening prayers and transcribing biblical passages for the community. His transformation was sudden and complete. The day before the incident, he had complained only of unusual dreams and a hollow feeling in his stomach that bread would not fill. His cousin Arnold had been helping repair the meeting house roof when Willoughby lured him into the storage shed. What the 3 men witnessed upon entering haunted them. Willoughby had opened Arnold's abdomen and was methodically consuming the organs, starting with the liver. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic. Nothing like the frenzy of a madman. 4 men dragged him to the root cellar. Throughout the struggle, Willoughby remained eerily calm, his eyes focused on some middle distance. He spoke only once more before they gagged him. "She says your hunger is different from mine, but soon we'll all eat the same." In the morning, they found him unconscious, his bonds intact, but his hands mangled. He had gnawed through his own fingers at the second knuckle, leaving bloody stumps. The severed digits were arranged in a familiar pattern on the dirt floor, the spiral glyph. But most disturbing was what they found inside his mouth. A small pulsing organ that resembled a heart, though too small to be human. It beat 3 times before dissolving into black ichor that burned through the wooden floor like acid. Willoughby never regained consciousness. He died 3 days later, his body gradually hardening until his skin resembled bark and his bones became brittle as dead wood. When they buried him, roots were already growing from his eyes. White began to unravel. He stopped speaking during meetings. He paced the perimeter alone at night, muttering to himself. His private journal, once orderly, became erratic, filled with half-formed glyphs and scratchings of open mouths. In one entry, he wrote, "I see her in the corners now, Not Eleanor, what she became. Virginia doesn't blink anymore. I think she's breathing for the forest. He began contemplating the unthinkable, abandonment. But the boats had rotted, their hulls blackened with mold. The nails had rusted to powder. Even the oars bent in unnatural arcs as though softened from within. They were trapped. White's quarters became a nest of paranoia. He hung dried garlic and crosses alongside native talismans Manteo had provided. He lined his doorway with salt and crushed herbs. He slept with a loaded pistol beneath his pillow and a knife strapped to his wrist. His once meticulous colony ledgers degenerated into rambling accounts of impossible observations. Saw footprints leading from the shore today. They started in deep water and walked onto land. The stride lengthened as they approached the settlement. By the palisade, they were 7 feet apart. The stars are wrong. Polaris has shifted. The bear now faces east. Found tooth marks on my door this morning. They are human, but too many. As though someone with 3 rows of teeth tried to bite through the wood. Eleanor spoke to me using my mother's voice. She knew things only mother could know. White called an assembly in the meeting house. Only 17 colonists attended, a third of those who remained. The others were too ill, too disturbed, or had barricaded themselves in their homes. We must consider abandoning Roanoke, White announced. Silence greeted his words, then nervous murmurs. And go where? Harriet asked, his marked forearm now constantly seeping clear fluid. Anywhere, White replied. Croatoan, perhaps. Or north toward Chesapeake. We cannot leave, said a voice from the back. Agnes Harris stood, her face gaunt, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. We have been claimed. The ground knows our blood now. Others nodded in agreement, their expressions vacant. White slammed his fist on the table. I am still governor. I order preparation for immediate relocation. No one moved. Later that day, White ordered an assessment of the boats. The news confirmed his worst fears. The colony's 3 remaining vessels were unsalvageable. Wood turned to sponge, metal corroded beyond use. Even the pitch and caulking had transformed into a substance resembling black honey, writhing with tiny translucent worms. It doesn't want us to leave, Eleanor Dare told him, his once strong voice now perpetually hoarse from screaming in his sleep. It's barely begun with us. Manteo prepared a ritual of protection. He fasted again. He bathed in ash. He gathered red soil from 7 corners of the island. At sundown, he stood at the colony's center, arms outstretched, eyes rolled back, as he began to chant in the tongue of his ancestors. The wind howled. The trees leaned inward. And then, a scream. A child burst from her hut, her body seized in convulsions. Her mouth opened wide, but it was not her voice that came out. It was deep. Male, ancient. You cannot bar what has already been invited. Manteo collapsed. The circle shattered. That night the child died. Her ribs cracked outward. For 3 days Manteo had prepared. He painted his body with symbols of protection, not the alien glyphs that had infected the colony, but ancient markings of his people. He constructed a circle of stones and feathers, each item purified with smoke and blessed with his blood. As dusk fell, he began his invocation, calling upon guardian spirits of earth, water, and sky. The colonists gathered at a distance, drawn by some collective instinct to witness the ritual. The air grew dense as Manteo chanted, his voice rising and falling in patterns that seemed to bend the firelight. For a moment, hope flickered across the watchers' faces. The oppressive presence that had settled over the colony seemed to lift slightly, like a predator hesitating. Then came the child, Emma Barr, only 5 years old. She erupted from her family's hut, body contorted, moving with jerky, puppet-like motions. Her head rotated too far, neck cracking audibly, her mouth stretched impossibly wide. The voice that emerged shook the ground beneath their feet. Deep and resonant, it carried the weight of ages, the cold assurance of something that had waited millennia and could wait millennia more. You cannot bar what has already been invited. The words struck Manteo like physical blows. He staggered, blood streaming from his nose and ears. The protective circle of stones exploded outward, pelting the gathered colonists. The ritual fires extinguished simultaneously. Emma's small body hovered several inches above the ground for a heartbeat, then collapsed. Her parents rushed to her, but froze when they reached her side. Beneath her nightclothes, her rib cage was bulging outward, bones cracking one by one. By morning, her body had split open like a seed pod, revealing not organs, but a tangle of roots and crystalline structures that glittered with inner light. The structures resembled the glyphs Harriet had documented, but three-dimensional, pulsing with faint bioluminescence. No one could bring themselves to bury her. The body remained where it had fallen, gradually sinking into the soil over the following days until it disappeared completely. A week later, strange flowers bloomed in that spot, black petals with stigmas that tracked movement like eyes. Eleanor no longer answered to her name. She spoke in rhythms, syllables that stung the ear. She walked the colony in loops, humming, barefoot, whispering to roots, pressing her hands against stones. "She's speaking for it," Manteo said grimly. "She is becoming its tongue." One night, Harriet asked her, trembling, "What do you want from us?" Eleanor tilted her head, and Virginia answered in her place, "Memory, a shape, and silence." Eleanor moved through the settlement like water, flowing, pausing, changing direction without reason. Her once bright eyes had turned milky, the irises expanded until almost no white remained. Her hair fell out in patches, replaced by fine, translucent filaments that moved independently of wind or gravity. She no longer ate or drank. When Ananias tried to force water between her lips, she vomited a viscous black substance that hardened into glass-like shards. Each shard contained a tiny scene, miniature landscapes of places no human had ever witnessed. At night, she traced patterns on the ground with her feet, leaving phosphorescent trails that lingered until dawn. Those who studied these patterns reported dreaming of vast libraries filled with books written in the glyphs, attended by librarians with too many limbs and no faces. Eleanor's voice changed daily, sometimes childlike, sometimes ancient, sometimes multiple voices speaking in harmony or counterpoint. The only constant was the rhythm, a cadence that colonists found themselves unconsciously adopting in their own speech. She showed special interest in pregnant women, placing her hands on their bellies and whispering to the unborn. 2 miscarried the following day, delivering infants with translucent skin that revealed not human organs, but intricate crystalline structures. Virginia, now nearly 9 months old, rarely cried. She watched everything with unnatural focus, tracking movements before they happened. She spoke only in response to direct questions about the entity and always in that impossible adult voice. When Harriet finally gathered the courage to ask what the entity wanted, the juxtaposition of Eleanor's vacant expression with Virginia's articulate response chilled the remaining rational part of his mind. "Memory," Virginia had said, her infant mouth forming each syllable with impossible precision. "A shape. And silence." "I don't understand," Harriet pressed. "It was forgotten," Virginia explained as though to a child. "Erased from creation. It needs to be remembered to fully return. It needs bodies shaped to its purpose. And it needs the silence that comes when all other voices stop." "Our deaths," Harriet whispered. Virginia smiled, a terrible expression on an infant's face. "Death is too simple, too final. It needs your voices to become its echo." 3 days after this conversation, Harriet was found in his hut, quill driven through his palm, still frantically transcribing glyph sequences with his own blood. He didn't stop when White entered, didn't acknowledge the governor's presence at all. "Thomas," White said carefully, "can you hear me?" Harriet paused, head tilting as though listening to something distant. "I hear everything now," he replied, voice cracking with wonder and terror. "The stones, the tide, the spaces between heartbeats." He looked up, tears streaming down his face. "It's so beautiful, John, so terrible. We were never meant to be so alone in our skulls." White backed away, hand on his dagger. "What's happening to us, Thomas?" "Transformation," Harriet whispered, returning to his transcription. Or translation. "We're becoming a new language." John White stood atop the watchtower and stared at the sky, now wrong in its constellations. He whispered, "We never landed. We were swallowed." And below him, the earth exhaled. The night sky had changed gradually over the months, but now the transformation was complete. The familiar patterns of stars, the navigational touchstones White had used throughout his seafaring life, had shifted. Polaris, the North Star, had relocated 10 degrees west. The Pleiades now numbered 9 sisters instead of 7. The moon's face showed continents that didn't exist. White had retreated to the watchtower after finding Harriet lost to whatever influence had claimed the others. From this vantage point, he could see the entire settlement, or what remained of it. Half the buildings stood empty. Those still occupied glowed with unnatural light that seeped through cracks and windows. Not the warm orange of hearth fires, but a cold blue-green phosphorescence. Shadows moved behind shutters, elongated and jointed in impossible ways. The forest had encroached on the cleared land, trees growing at an accelerated rate. Some bore fruit, despite it being the wrong season. Black, pulpy orbs that whispered when touched. Animals avoided the settlement entirely now. Even insects had vanished, replaced by floating motes that resembled pollen but moved with purpose. White clutched his journal to his chest, the last record of Roanoke's demise, should anyone ever find it. His final entries documented his conclusions. This place was never meant for us. The land rejected our presence from the beginning, not as invaders, but as infection. We thought we were claiming virgin soil. Instead, we disturbed something ancient that slept beneath. Virginia was the key, the first English child born here, a bridge between worlds. Through her it speaks, through Eleanor it moves, through all of us it remembers. We never landed on Roanoke, we were swallowed by it. As this realization settled into White's mind, the ground beneath the settlement shifted. Not a violent earthquake, but a slow, deliberate movement. The rise and fall of a massive chest drawing breath. White clutched the railing as the watchtower swayed. Below, colonists emerged from their huts, moving in unison toward the center of the settlement. Eleanor led them, Virginia in her arms. The child's eyes glowed in the darkness like twin moons. The earth exhaled, and with its breath came words, not heard but felt, resonating through bone and blood. The message was clear, even to White's increasingly fractured mind. You have prepared the way. The door opens. The forgotten returns. He descended the ladder with shaking hands, determined to make one final attempt to save his granddaughter. But as his feet touched the ground, he knew it was too late. The soil beneath Roanoke had become translucent, revealing vast networks of crystalline roots that pulsed with light. The colonists stood in a perfect circle, their skin marks glowing in synchrony with the pulses below. At the center, Eleanor raised Virginia toward the distorted stars, and the child began to sing. Chapter 10. The Departure. John White stood on the beach, staring at the fractured hull of the pinnace. For days he had resisted. To leave was to abandon, to stay was to rot. But now, with men dying, others lost to madness, and the colony fracturing like old bone, he saw the truth carved in every waking moment. They were no longer settlers. They were prisoners. The larger of their 2 remaining vessels, though weathered and compromised, could be made seaworthy with enough patching and prayer. Supplies were minimal, the sea was uncertain, but England, desperate, distant, decaying England, still held the possibility of reinforcements, of salvation. He had to try. The tide lapped at White's boots as he circled the listing vessel. Barnacles had colonized the hull in patterns that resembled the glyphs from Harriet's translations, perfect spirals and interconnected whorls that no natural growth should form. The wood itself had taken on a grayish hue, as though the very fiber had been leached of vitality. When White pressed his palm against the planking, it yielded slightly, like flesh rather than oak. He withdrew his hand quickly, wiping it against his breeches. "She'll need caulking," Roger Beasley said, appearing at White's side. The ship's carpenter was one of the few colonists who retained some semblance of practical skill. His eyes were bloodshot but focused, his hands steady despite the tremor that had claimed so many others. "And we'll need to replace that section of keel. It's soft, rotten from within." White nodded. "How long?" 3 days. 4 if the weather turns." Beasley's gaze drifted toward the tree line. "Though weather isn't natural here anymore, is it?" Since Virginia's confrontation with the entity, the island's climate had developed patterns that defied seasonal logic. Mornings dawned with thick frost even in summer heat. Afternoon clouds formed precise geometric shapes before dissolving into mist that moved against the wind. Rain fell upward as often as down. "We'll depart as soon as she's seaworthy," White said, not answering the question. "I'll need a small crew, volunteers only." Beasley gave a humorless laugh. "You'll have no shortage. Most would swim to England if they thought they could survive the journey." He paused, expression darkening. "Though it may not let us leave so easily." White had considered this. The colony was unmistakably claimed by something ancient and patient. Its influence had metastasized through the settlement, consuming minds, reshaping flesh, speaking through infant mouths. The question wasn't whether it would allow their departure, but what price it might extract for the privilege. "We must try," White said simply. Beasley stared at the horizon. "My sister spoke to me last night, came right into my hut and sat on my bed." He swallowed hard. "She's been dead 3 years, Governor." White said nothing. "She told me we're already gone." Beasley's voice cracked. "Said we left long ago, and what remains is just meat, remembering what it once was." White clasped the man's shoulder. "Get some rest. We begin repairs at first light." As Beasley trudged back toward the palisade, White noticed dark spots forming in the wet sand where the carpenter's feet had been. Not footprints, but perfect circles that bubbled briefly before dissolving back into the beach. That night, White recorded his decision in his journal, the pages now warped and discolored despite his efforts to keep them dry. His handwriting had changed, becoming more angular, with certain letters consistently malformed in ways that resembled Harriet's transcribed glyphs. "I am resolved to return to England. This mission is not abandonment, but necessity. What afflicts Roanoke cannot be fought with our current resources. We require men of faith and science, weapons both physical and spiritual. I pray the passage home will be swift, and that what remains of our colony can endure until my return. Yet I fear what I leave behind is no longer the settlement I founded. My daughter shows no recognition when I speak. Virginia, my own blood, watches me with eyes that have never been a child's. And the others, they move through familiar motions like actors who have forgotten they perform. God grant me swift winds and Roanoke the strength to resist what grows beneath it." His quill paused above the final words. In the wavering candlelight, the ink seemed to shift on the page, letters rearranging themselves when he looked away. White pinched the bridge of his nose, fighting the exhaustion that never truly left him now. When he looked again at what he'd written, the last line had changed. "You have never been here." He slammed the journal shut and extinguished the candle with trembling fingers. He announced the decision beneath the longhouse eaves. No applause, no argument. Just hollow nods and stares. Even Harriet said nothing, merely tightening the straps on a rotting satchel and murmuring to himself. Eleanor was the only one who spoke. "You won't find anything," she said, holding Virginia, "but it's good you're leaving." White blinked. "You want me gone?" She didn't answer, but Virginia smiled. The assembled colonists stood in the shadow of the longhouse, their faces gaunt and eyes recessed. Many bore the physical manifestations of the island's influence, skin marked with symbols that pulsed faintly, hair grown coarse and reed-like, fingernails hardened into translucent shell. Some exhibited more extreme transformations: a woman whose tears left crystalline tracks down her cheeks, a man whose spine had elongated, forcing him to stoop beneath the eaves, children whose fingers had fused into paddle-like appendages perfect for digging. They were changing, not at random, but with purpose, each alteration seemingly designed for specific function. White cleared his throat. "I will sail with 3 volunteers. We will make for England with all haste, secure supplies and reinforcements, and return before winter." No one asked which winter. Time had become elastic on Roanoke, days that stretched into seeming weeks, nights that passed in heartbeats. The seasons themselves had decoupled from any recognizable progression. "In my absence, Eleanor Dare will govern the colony." White gestured to his son-in-law, who stood apart from the others, his once proud bearing diminished. Ananias nodded mechanically. his eyes never leaving Eleanor. "Any who wish to send messages to England may deliver them to me before tomorrow's tide," White continued. No one moved. No one offered journals or letters or tokens to be carried across the sea. Their silence was not simply resignation, it was disconnection, as though England existed in a reality they no longer inhabited. Only Harriet showed any reaction, fidgeting with the straps of his satchel. The scholar's transformation was among the most advanced. Veins of luminous blue ran beneath his skin, mapping constellations that didn't exist in any human sky. His eyes had developed secondary pupils that dilated independently of the primary ones. "Thomas," White said softly, "will you record any observations for our return?" Harriet looked up, his expression briefly clearing. "I've been recording everything, Governor, but not for you." He patted his satchel. "For them. The translation must be complete." White's heart sank. Harriet had been the colony's most rational mind, its scientific anchor. To see him fully claimed by the influence was to witness the final capitulation of reason. Eleanor stepped forward, Virginia balanced on her hip. The child, now nearly 10 months old, had the physical development of a much older toddler. Her eyes contained knowledge no infant should possess. "You won't find anything," Eleanor repeated, her voice carrying an undercurrent like distant surf. "But it's good you're leaving." The double meaning was clear. England would offer no salvation, but White's departure served some purpose in the entity's design. "You want me gone?" he asked, searching his daughter's face for any trace of the woman he'd known. Eleanor didn't answer, her gaze sliding past him to some middle distance, but Virginia's small mouth curved into a smile that contained centuries of patience. Later, as White packed his sparse belongings, Manteo visited his quarters. The natives' resistance to the influence had proven stronger than most colonists. Though even he showed signs of change, his eyes now reflective like a cat's, his speech interspersed with clicks and vibrations that seemed to communicate directly with the surrounding air. "You should not return," Manteo said without preamble. White paused in his packing. "I must bring help." "There is no help," Manteo replied. "What happens here is older than both our peoples. It cannot be fought with gunpowder or prayer." "Then what would you have me do?" White demanded. "Abandon them." "They are already abandoned." Manteo's expression softened with pity. "What remains are vessels. The colony died months ago." White slammed his fist against the table. "My daughter lives. My granddaughter lives." "No," Manteo said gently. "What wears your daughter's skin is not Eleanor. And Virginia." He hesitated. "Virginia was never just your granddaughter. She was the first to be born here, on soil that remembers what came before. She was always meant to be its voice." White turned away, unable to bear the truth in Manteo's words. "The crossing will be dangerous," Manteo continued. "It will reach for you even across water. If you must go, take this." He pressed something into White's palm, a small pouch of red ochre and crushed herbs. "Keep it against your skin. It may help you remember who you are." White instructed the colonists to leave a message, a sign should they relocate or be forced to flee. They would carve it into the palisade. If they left under threat, they would add a Maltese cross. No one argued. The ritual of it, the act of carving, gave the illusion of control. The next morning, the word was there. Croatoan. Etched deep into the main post, the letters long and gouged, as though carved not with tools, but with bone. No cross, no panic. Just direction. White stared at the inscription, a chill seeping into his marrow. He had expected Roger Pratt or one of the other men to undertake the carving, a simple precaution, an agreed-upon message for any who might come searching. But no one admitted to cutting the word into the palisade post. The letters stood nearly 2 feet high, gouged so deeply that the wood had splintered along their edges. They glistened with moisture despite the dry morning air. Croatoan, the island to the south where Manteo's people dwelled. A logical refuge if disaster struck Roanoke, yet something about the inscription filled White with dread. The letters themselves seemed subtly malformed, each line curving at angles that suggested the glyphs Harriet had transcribed. And beneath the surface meaning lay another, something that whispered of thresholds and transformation. White ran his fingers along the rough edges of the sea. The wood was warm to the touch and seemed to vibrate faintly, like silent laughter. "It's perfect," came Eleanor's voice behind him. White turned to find his daughter standing with Virginia in her arms. Both watched him with identical expressions, patient, knowing, vaguely amused. "Did you do this?" White asked. Eleanor tilted her head. "Everyone did." "What does it mean?" White pressed. "Tell me the truth, Eleanor." "Croatoan isn't just an island," Virginia answered, her infant mouth forming adult words. "It's what was here before. The first name, the true name." "It's where we're going," Eleanor added, her voice overlapping with her daughter's in perfect harmony. "Where we've always been going. It's not a place you can follow." White reached for his daughter, but she stepped away, maintaining precise distance. "Eleanor, please, come with me to England. You and Virginia both. We can return when it's safer." For a moment something flickered behind Eleanor's eyes, a brief flash of the woman she had been. Her lips trembled. "Father," she whispered, her voice suddenly her own, "I'm still here." "Sometimes. In the spaces between." White moved toward her, hope surging. "Then fight it. Come with me." The moment passed, Eleanor's expression smoothed into placid emptiness. "The ship is ready," she said, her voice once again layered with that alien resonance. "You should go now. The tide is turning." As White passed through the palisade gate for the final time, he noticed dark fluid seeping from the carved letters. It ran down the wooden post in rivulets, forming smaller symbols on the ground before sinking into the soil. The word remained, Croatoan. White took a crew of 3. The ship slipped from the bay beneath a flat sky, sails sagging like tired lungs. He turned only once. Eleanor stood at the palisade, face expressionless, wind pulling her hair across her cheeks. Her arms hung limp. Virginia was not in them. He opened his mouth, to wave, to speak, to call out something fatherly, but her eyes stopped him. Empty, endless, watching him leave like she had seen it all before. The 3 volunteers were the least affected by the island's influence, a boatswain named Collins, a farmer called Webb, and surprisingly, Roger Pratt, whose earlier accusations against Manteo had given way to a grim determination to escape at any cost. As they pushed away from shore, White noted how the water around the hull seemed reluctant to part, clinging to the wood in defiance of natural movement. The sky above hung unnaturally low, clouds arranged in patterns that mirrored the layout of the settlement. White stood at the tiller, guiding the patched vessel through the narrow channel that led to open sea. The tide pulled against them despite Beasley's calculations, as though the very water conspired to prevent their departure. "Row harder," he ordered, watching the shoreline with growing unease. The men strained at the oars, faces slick with sweat despite the cool air. The boat moved with agonizing slowness, each yard gained through obvious struggle. "It's like pulling through mud," Collins gasped, his oar bending unnaturally with each stroke. White's gaze remained fixed on the receding settlement. The colonists had gathered at the palisade to watch their departure, a silent audience arranged in precise formations that from the water resembled one of Harriet's transcribed glyphs. At the center stood Eleanor, her figure distinct even at this distance. Her red dress caught what little light filtered through the flat clouds, making her appear to smolder against the weathered wood of the palisade. White raised his hand in farewell, though he knew she wouldn't respond. But as the boat finally caught the outgoing tide and began to move more freely, Eleanor's posture changed. Her back straightened, her head tilted upward, and her arms, previously hanging limp at her sides, raised slowly outward. Not in farewell, but in a gesture that suggested release or offering. "Where's the child?" Webb asked suddenly, squinting toward shore. "The governor's grandchild." White scanned the assembled colonists. Virginia was indeed absent from her mother's arms or anywhere visible along the palisade. A spike of fear drove through him. "Perhaps she's in their quarters," he said, trying to convince himself. "No," Pratt said, his voice hollow. "Look there." He pointed toward the tree line beyond the settlement. At first, White saw nothing, then movement caught his eye, a small figure in white, standing perfectly still at the edge of the forest. Even at this distance, he could see that it was Virginia. impossibly alone and upright for a child her age. As he watched, she raised one tiny hand in perfect mimicry of her mother's gesture. The wind died completely. The boat slowed, then stopped, despite the outgoing tide. "Row," White commanded, unable to tear his gaze from his granddaughter's distant figure. The men heaved at the oars, muscles straining. The boat resumed its slow progress toward the open sea. White turned only once more as they finally cleared the bay. Eleanor remained at the palisade, arms outstretched. Virginia had vanished back into the trees. The settlement itself seemed to waver slightly in White's vision, as though he viewed it through disturbed water. For a brief, terrible moment, he thought he saw something massive shift beneath the island, a suggestion of vast movement, of scales or segments realigning. But he blinked, and the illusion passed. What remained was Roanoke, silent, waiting, watching him leave as though his departure had been ordained since before the colony's founding. By nightfall, a black fog rolled in from the forest. Thick and low, it poured through the spaces in the palisade like liquid ink. It carried no scent, yet clung to the skin. Visibility dropped to arm's length. Sound muted, time bent. A woman swore her dead child spoke from the fog. Another claimed her own face, looked back at her through the mist. Eleanor did not flinch. She walked through it barefoot, Virginia beside her, the child's tiny hand clasped in hers. The fog parted for them, and behind them the trees began to move. Those remaining at Roanoke witnessed the fog's approach from the western forest, not blown by wind, but advancing with deliberate purpose, rolling between the trees like conscious liquid. It reached the edge of the cleared land and paused, gathering density, becoming so dark that it appeared solid. Then it surged forward, flowing through gaps in the palisade, seeping under doorways, infiltrating every corner of the settlement in minutes. Colonists who touched it reported numbness, followed by visions. Not hallucinations, but glimpses into spaces that existed alongside their own reality. Through these momentary windows, they saw cities with impossible architecture, oceans that flowed upward, and creatures that moved in dimensions human minds struggled to comprehend. Mary Harvey screamed when the fog formed into the shape of her son, dead 3 months prior. The apparition spoke to her in perfect recall of his voice, describing in detail the sensation of his body dissolving into the soil, becoming part of what lived beneath. George Howe stumbled from his hut, clawing at his eyes. "My face," he gasped, "my face in the mist." But wrong, changed, years from now. The fog flowed around Eleanor as she emerged from her quarters, Virginia walking steadily beside her despite her young age. The black mist parted before them, creating a path of clear air that extended wherever they moved. Virginia's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, twin points of blue-green light that left trailing after-images. She walked with the confidence of an adult, small hand clasped in her mother's. Behind them, at the edge of the forest, the trees began to shift, not swaying in wind, but uprooting, repositioning, reorienting themselves into patterns visible only from above. Roots tore free of soil with sounds like breaking bones. Trunks twisted toward the settlement, branches reaching like supplicant arms. Eleanor led Virginia to the center of the colony, where the carved word on the palisade post was now weeping dark fluid in earnest. The liquid pooled on the ground, forming a perfect circle around mother and child. "Is it time?" Ananias asked, emerging from the fog to stand at the circle's edge. His transformation had accelerated in the hours since White's departure. His skin now translucent in patches, revealing not muscle and bone, but crystalline structures that pulsed with internal light. Eleanor nodded. "Father has gone. The circle closes." "And the others?" Harriet asked, joining them. His eyes had fully transformed now, pupils split and multiplied until they resembled insect eyes. "Those who still resist." Virginia looked up, her child's face serene. "They'll understand soon. When the breathing starts." Deep beneath the island, something stirred. Roots twisted, stone pulsed, and the earth exhaled, long, low, guttural, like lungs expanding after centuries of stillness. Above ground, the palisade stood firm. But the word remained, Croatoan waiting. The first tremor was subtle, a vibration that rippled through the soil, causing pottery to rattle on shelves and water in barrels to form perfect concentric circles. Few colonists noticed, distracted as they were by the black fog and its visions. The second tremor was stronger. Buildings swayed. The ground produced a low groan, like stressed wood about to snap. Manteo felt it first. He had retreated to the edge of the settlement, preparing one final ritual of protection, not for the colonists, but for whoever might come searching for them in years to come. As the vibration passed through him, he dropped to his knees, pressing his palms flat against the earth. "It wakes," he whispered. "The island remembers itself." What lay beneath Roanoke was not simply an entity or presence, it was the original form of the land itself, the true shape that had been buried beneath sediment and soil over eons. The colony had been built not on an island, but on a segment of something vaster, a fragment of anatomy belonging to a being that predated continents. And now, with the glyphs activated, the colonists transformed, and White's departure removing the final obstacle, it was remembering its true nature. The third tremor split the earth in dozens of places, not random cracks, but precise lines that formed larger versions of the glyphs Harriet had documented. From these fissures rose phosphorescent gases that twisted into coherent shapes before dispersing into the black fog. The colonists gathered in the settlement's center, arranging themselves in concentric circles around Eleanor and Virginia. Their transformations accelerated visibly now, skin hardening into chitin or softening into translucent membranes, limbs elongating or multiplying, features shifting to accommodate new sensory organs. They were becoming a new species, or rather, returning to an older one. As the fog thickened and the tremors intensified, the island itself seemed to inhale, the very air rushing inland from all directions. Trees bent toward the settlement. The sea retreated suddenly from the shore, exposing rutted seabeds marked with fossilized glyphs larger than buildings. Then came the exhalation. The ground rose and fell like a massive chest. The sound that accompanied the movement was not truly audible. It registered first in the bones, then in the mind, a frequency that bypassed ears entirely. Those fully claimed by the transformation heard words in that vibration, instructions written into the fabric of reality itself. Virginia raised her small arms toward the churning sky, her body glowing now with the same phosphorescence that emanated from the earth's fissures. She spoke in that impossible adult voice, but amplified 100-fold, reaching beyond the island to the distant ship carrying her grandfather toward the horizon. "Remember," she intoned, "return, reclaim." The palisade wall, constructed with such hope and industry months earlier, began to warp and twist. The wood grain rearranged itself, forming smaller versions of the carved word that now bled freely down its surface. Croatoan. The word was not a destination or warning. It was a name, an invocation, a summoning. And as the island continued its rhythmic breathing, the colonists completed their transformation, no longer human, no longer separate individuals, but components in a vast organism that stretched from the center of the settlement down through the island's depths and out into the surrounding seas. They had not been abandoned. They had been absorbed. From the ship, now miles distant, White watched as strange lights pulsed above Roanoke. The horizon behind them wavered, reality itself seeming to thin around the island. "What's happening?" Collins asked, voice trembling. White clutched Manteo's pouch tightly, feeling the protective herbs warm against his palm. "Croatoan," he whispered, though he didn't fully understand the word's true meaning. The vessel surged forward suddenly, caught in a current that shouldn't exist, carrying them eastward at unnatural speed, as though the sea itself were eager to deliver them away from Roanoke, from America, from the awakening that had begun. White looked down at his hand and saw with growing horror that his skin had begun to change. A small pattern forming beneath the surface, similar to the marks that had appeared on the colonists. He pressed Manteo's pouch harder against the mark, praying it would be enough to preserve his humanity until they reached England. Behind them, Roanoke Island faded into darkness. But the change had begun, and when White returned, if he returned, what awaited would no longer be a colony. It would be a transformation, a doorway, a homecoming for something that had waited longer than human memory to reclaim what had always been its own. Chapter 11. The Lost Fort, August 18th in 1590. John White stood on the deck of the Hopewell, eyes straining toward the coastline of Roanoke Island. The ship bobbed gently in the surf, sails furled, crewmen silent. They had arrived on the third birthday of Virginia Dare, his granddaughter. He clutched that thought like a charm against the gnawing dread inside. 3 years had passed since he left. 3 years of war with Spain, delays, broken promises, and political cold shoulders. 3 years of wondering if Eleanor lived, if Virginia still breathed. The wind carried no answers, only silence. White's knuckles whitened against the ship's rail. His journey back to England had been plagued with misfortune, storms that appeared from clear skies, currents that pulled them off course, and the strange mark on his hand that had spread and then faded, leaving a pale scar shaped like a spiral. The protective herbs Manteo had given him had turned to dust within a fortnight of their departure from Roanoke. England itself had offered no sanctuary. The Spanish Armada had consumed all attention and resources. His pleas for immediate return to the colony fell on deaf ears at court. Raleigh had lost interest in the venture. Funding dried up, every promised ship was reassigned to war efforts. White had sold his possessions, begged favors, prostrated himself before merchants and nobles alike. 3 years of degradation and desperation, all for this moment, this return. "Captain says we'll make landfall within the hour," said Abraham Cobb, the quartermaster. Cobb was a practical man, weathered by years at sea, not given to fancy, yet even he had grown uneasy as they approached the island. Strange waters these, too calm. White nodded absently. The sea around Roanoke was indeed unnaturally still, a perfect mirror reflecting clouds that moved too quickly above. No birds circled the ship, though shorebirds should have been plentiful. "We'll find them," White said, more to himself than to Cobb. "They'll have maintained the settlement, perhaps expanded it." Cobb made the sign of the cross. "God willing." But God seemed distant from these shores. As the longboats were prepared for landing, White studied the coastline through his spyglass. The familiar inlets and beaches appeared overgrown, reclaimed by vegetation. No smoke rose from where the settlement had stood. No figures moved along the shore, just tangled green and waiting silence. In his cabin, White opened his journal, the continuation of the one he'd kept during his governorship. Though this volume contained only questions, fears, and desperate prayers penned during his forced exile in England. Its pages held sketches of Eleanor's face from memory, diagrams of how the settlement might have expanded, lists of supplies he'd promised to return with, promises largely unfulfilled. The Hopewell carried men and weapons, but few of the tools and provisions the colony would have needed. His final entry before landing read simply, "I return today. Virginia is 3 years old. Eleanor will have taught her English prayers and songs. Croatoan may be their home now, if danger forced relocation. I pray for signs of life. I pray for absence of crosses." White closed the journal and tucked it inside his doublet, close to his heart. Then he joined the landing party. The landing party moved through overgrown paths with caution. Salt air clung to everything, but no birds called. No insects buzzed. White's boots pressed into moss where once there had been clearings. The settlement lay ahead, and it was intact. Not overrun, not razed, not looted, just empty. "Careful now," White cautioned as they approached the first structures. 15 men had come ashore, armed with muskets and swords, expecting either joyful reunion or tragic discovery. They found neither. Instead, they entered a settlement suspended between existence and abandonment. The houses had been dismantled neatly, logs stacked, roofs removed. Gardens gone to seed. No signs of fire or violence. The ground bore no bodies, no blood, just the stillness of abandonment. White's throat tightened. Where is everyone? He moved to what had been the Dare household. The foundation remained, but the walls had been systematically removed. The logs stacked in perfect crosses nearby. Eleanor's small garden had grown wild, yet strangely organized. Plants arranged in spirals rather than rows. species intertwined in patterns that seemed deliberate. Inside the foundation, pressed into the dirt floor, White found a child's footprint, too large to be from when he'd left. Virginia had walked here sometime in the intervening years. He knelt, touching the impression gently. "Governor," called Thomas Coleman, a sailor with sharp eyes, "there's something you should see." White followed Coleman to what had been the storehouse. Unlike the other buildings, its foundation bore scorch marks. But the burning had not been chaotic or violent. Perfect circles of char marked the dirt in a pattern White recognized with growing unease. The same spiral glyph that had appeared after Virginia's confrontation with the entity. "What does it mean, sir?" Coleman asked. White couldn't bring himself to answer. The memory of that night, the entity rising from the earth, Virginia's impossible adult voice commanding it to wait, remained too vivid, too terrifying to articulate. "Governor White." Another call, more urgent. One sailor called from near the eastern edge. "Sir, the palisade, it's new." They approached cautiously. The old low fence had been replaced with a towering wall of sharpened logs, fortified with packed clay and rope. A defensive perimeter, strong, recent. But as they circled it, White realized something strange. The sharpened ends of the logs pointed inward, not outward. This was not a wall designed to keep attackers out. It was designed to keep something in. "The gate's been sealed," reported Cobb, examining the heavy logs that had been lashed together where the entrance had once stood. From the outside, White stepped forward and traced the markings on the main post with his fingertips. The word carved deep and wide, Croatoan, no cross, no second word, no plea for help. Just that. The letters were deeply incised, the edges smoothed as though the carving had been done months or even years ago and weathered by seasons. When White ran his finger along the C, a splinter drove deep into his flesh. He pulled back, watching as a bead of blood welled and dropped onto the soil. The ground seemed to absorb it with unusual thirst. He stepped back, voice hoarse. "They left of their own will," the others murmured. Relief mixed with confusion. "Croatoan," he repeated, nodding. "They went to Manteo's people." But the syllables felt strange in his mouth now, like they carried weight, like the wood remembered the hand that carved them. "We should open this," White decided, pointing to the sealed gate. "Search inside the palisade." 4 men set to work with axes, cutting through the bindings. As the first rope snapped, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, not from the sea, but from the forest, carrying a scent of decay and something else, something metallic and wrong. "Did you hear that?" Coleman asked, freezing mid-swing. "Hear what?" White asked. "Children, laughing." Coleman's face had paled, just for a moment. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but continued their work. When the gate finally gave way and swung inward, they recoiled instinctively from what lay beyond. Not horror, not carnage. Just wrongness. Inside the palisade was a perfect circle of bare earth, no structures, no possessions. The ground had been meticulously cleared and smoothed, then marked with shallow channels that formed an elaborate pattern. A massive version of the glyphs Harriet had documented, recognizable to White even after 3 years. "What is it?" Cobb whispered. "A map," White replied, though he wasn't sure why he said it. "Or a key." At the center of the pattern sat a single object, a crude doll made from corn husks and twine. Virginia's doll. White approached it slowly, feeling the men's reluctance to follow. He knelt and lifted the toy. It felt wrong in his hands, too heavy, too dense. When he turned it over, black fluid seeped from its woven head, staining his fingers. "Governor," Cobb said urgently, "look at the ground." Where the doll had rested, the earth had begun to sink inward, forming a small depression that deepened as they watched. The soil moved like liquid, circling downward as though following an invisible drain. White dropped the doll and stumbled back. The men retreated hastily from the palisade, slamming the gate closed behind them. No one spoke as they secured it again with rope from their supplies. The sun dipped low, the forest cast long shadows. White searched for personal signs: Eleanor's comb, a child's doll, books, drawings, ink. Anything familiar. He found his old chest buried beneath vines, cracked open, its contents rotted. Damp pages, mold-flecked sketches, his crucifix warped and twisted like it had been pressed in fire. "I left this locked in the longhouse," White murmured, sifting through the ruined contents. "Someone brought it here, buried it." The papers were largely illegible, ink blurred by moisture and time, but one page remained partially readable, a letter begun by Eleanor but never finished. The date placed it 6 months after his departure. "Father, the changes accelerate. Virginia speaks in full sentences. What once inhabited her only shows itself at night now. We have completed the first circle. Harriet believes." The rest had dissolved into mottled stains. White searched for more legible fragments, but found only decay. He stepped back, then he heard it. His name, whispered from the trees. "John." The voice was slow, drawn, unmistakably human but hollow, like spoken through a pipe of bone. He spun, hand on his dagger. Nothing moved. The forest breathed. "Did you hear that?" White asked the nearest sailor, a young man named Jenkins. Jenkins nodded, face ashen. "A woman's voice." "My daughter," White said. "It sounded like Eleanor." "No, sir," Jenkins whispered. "It sounded like it was wearing her voice." The men drew closer together as the shadows lengthened. What had begun as a search mission now felt increasingly like trespass. The island was not abandoned. It was occupied by something unseen, something that watched and waited. "We should return to the ship before dark," Cobb suggested, gripping his musket tightly. "No," White said firmly. "We'll make camp here. Light fires. In the morning we'll investigate further, perhaps search the forest." "The forest, sir?" Jenkins looked horrified. "My people may have left signs, trail markers, something to indicate where they've gone." White's tone left no room for argument, though his own unease grew with each passing minute. The sailors grew restless. One claimed he saw a child behind the brush, peeking through leaves. Another swore she heard singing, Eleanor's voice calling Virginia's name. White tried to reassure them. "They're gone, safe, moved to Croatoan." But his voice cracked on the word safe, because something felt very, very wrong. They established camp in what had been the colony's central plaza. 3 fires were lit in a triangle pattern, an old sailor's precaution against night spirits, Cobb explained. The flames struggled to catch, the wood hissing and popping unnaturally despite being dry. "I've never seen firefight like this," Coleman observed as he fed another branch to the reluctant flames. "Like it doesn't want to burn here." Jenkins was assigned first watch, but within an hour he approached White, shaking violently. "Governor," he stammered, "there's someone walking between the trees, a woman in white. She has no—" He swallowed hard. "She has no face, sir." 2 sailors went to investigate, returning pale but reporting nothing unusual. Yet each subsequent watch reported similar sightings. Figures at the forest edge, shapes that moved unnaturally, sounds that couldn't be identified. As dusk bled into night, the shadows thickened unnaturally. The campfire sputtered despite dry wood. One sailor grew sick, vomiting bile with flecks of moss. Another trembled violently and whispered, "The trees. They're watching." White recorded all of it in his journal by shaking candlelight. No sign of struggle, no distress. Yet something lingers. As if the island itself has memory, the palisade speaks not protection, but imprisonment. And the silence, it is not peace. It is a held breath. The air grew heavy as midnight approached. Breathing became labored, as though the atmosphere had thickened. The fires dimmed to mere embers, despite constant tending. Coleman approached White, his face drawn in the feeble light. "Governor, there's something you should see." He led White to the edge of camp, where the ground met the forest. There, pressed into the soft earth, was a line of footprints, small, a child's, leading into the trees. "They weren't there an hour ago," Coleman whispered. "I swear it. The ground was clear." White knelt, examining the impressions. They were fresh, the edges sharp in the soil, child-sized, but with an adult's deliberate gait. Each print perfectly aligned with the next, no scuffing or hesitation. "Virginia," White whispered, heart pounding. The forest seemed to sigh in response, branches swaying without wind. Against all reason, against the protests of his men, White knew he had to follow. He took a torch from the fire, the flame reluctantly transferring to the pitch-soaked cloth, and approached the tree line. "I'll go alone," he told Cobb. "Keep the men here. If I'm not back by dawn, return to the ship and make for Croatoan Island." "Governor, this isn't wise," Cobb argued. "Whatever made those prints is possibly my granddaughter," White finished, "or leads to her." Without waiting for further objection, White followed the trail into the darkness. He approached the woods alone before sleep, lantern swaying. "Eleanor?" he called. "Virginia." Only wind replied, then, just once, like an exhale, "John." His lantern flickered. In the brush, eyes gleamed, high, wrongly spaced, then gone. The footprints led him deeper into the forest, a straight path where no path should exist. Trees that should have blocked the way seemed to lean aside as he approached. The ground beneath his feet felt increasingly spongy, yielding with each step like flesh rather than soil. His torch illuminated strange growths on the trees, not moss or fungi, but crystalline structures that resembled the glyphs from Harriet's translations. They pulsed faintly with bioluminescence as he passed. The air grew warmer, moist, carrying scents that didn't belong in a coastal forest. Metallic, mineral, with undertones of rot and salt. White's skin prickled with sweat that felt too thick, too viscous. The footprints ended abruptly at a small clearing. At its center stood a tree unlike any White had seen before, twisted and gnarled, its bark formed into patterns that resembled faces in agony. Its branches reached upward in a perfect spiral, leaves unnaturally still despite the breeze. At its base sat a child. For one glorious, terrible moment, White believed it was Virginia. The size was right. The posture, small legs crossed, head tilted in curiosity, achingly familiar from his memories of infancy. "Virginia," he whispered, stepping closer. The child turned. Not Virginia, not human. Its face was smooth, featureless, except for indentations where eyes should be and a seam where a mouth might form. Its skin had the texture of bark, with faint luminous patterns tracing beneath the surface. White stumbled backward, torch thrust forward in instinctive defense. The seam on the child's face split open, not a mouth but a gash that widened to reveal darkness and a voice that emerged from that void. "John, you came back." Eleanor's voice, perfect in intonation and timbre. "Where is my daughter?" White demanded, fear giving way to desperate anger. "Where is my granddaughter?" The child thing tilted its head. "Here," it said, still in Eleanor's voice. Then, in Virginia's childish tones, "There." Finally, in a chorus of voices White recognized as colonists. Everywhere. It stood, movements fluid yet wrong, joints bending in impossible directions. "You left us," it said, voice shifting between Eleanor's and something ancient and hollow. "But you came back, as it said you would." "What are you?" White whispered. "Memory," the thing replied. "Shape, silence." The exact words Virginia had spoken to Harriet before White's departure. Once nothing, now becoming. It extended a hand, too long, fingers splitting at the tips into twisting tendrils. "Come see, come understand. They wait for you." White backed away, torch held between them. "Where are they? Tell me." "Croatoan," the thing said, but the word emerged distorted, stretched, layered with harmonics that made White's teeth vibrate. Not a place, a state of being, a transformation. The twisted tree behind the child thing began to move, bark splitting to reveal pulsing, wet tissue beneath. The branches bent downward, reaching for White. He turned and ran, crashing through undergrowth, dropping his torch in panic. Behind him, something pursued, not with footsteps, but with a sliding, rushing sound, like water over stone. He emerged from the forest near the camp, lungs burning, legs weak with terror. The men startled at his appearance, reaching for weapons. "Governor," Cobb exclaimed, "what happened?" White couldn't speak immediately. When he finally caught his breath, he managed only, "We leave. Now, back to the ship." "But the search, they're gone," White said with finality. "All of them, changed." The men needed no further encouragement. They gathered their equipment with frantic efficiency, constantly glancing toward the forest edge where shadows seemed to pulse and shift. As they prepared to depart, White approached the palisade one final time. The carved word seemed to have deepened since their arrival. the letters now seeping a clear fluid that caught the pre-dawn light. Croatoan. He pressed his palm against the carving, a farewell to all he had lost. The wood was warm, vibrating subtly beneath his touch. For a brief moment, he thought he felt an answering pressure, as though someone on the other side pushed back. He did not sleep that night. Nor did the island. It only waited. As dawn broke and the landing party made their way back to the shore, White looked back one final time. The settlement seemed to waver in the morning light, its outlines blurring as though viewed through water. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw them all. Eleanor, Virginia, Ananias, Harriet, every colonist, standing in a perfect circle at the center of the palisade. But they were changed, remade into something no longer fully human. Virginia stood at their center, 3 years old yet impossibly tall, her arms raised toward the sky. Her eyes, visible even at this distance, glowed with the same phosphorescence that had marked the forest. Then the vision faded, leaving only empty ruins and the carved word that was not a destination, but a transformation. White turned away, following his men to the longboats. Behind him, the forest exhaled one final time, carrying his name on its breath. John, come back to us. He never would. But Roanoke would remember him, would wait for others, would welcome them home.